Hi again, Mark here from Talkingbass. This week I'm going to take a look at this little bad boy. This is called the Nordy Mute. It's a simple muting device from Nordstrand audio that you can slide on and off your strings to get that cool retro muted tone whenever you want. But what about simple foam, I hear you cry? Well, let's take a closer look at why the Nordy Mute is a great alternative even at the higher price point. So, why would you want to mute the strings on your bass? Well, as you may or may not know, many early bass models like the Fender Precision would have rubber mutes attached to the underside of the bridge cover that would push against the strings, giving that muted sound that you'll especially recognise from all the old Motown bass lines of James Jamerson. Remember, electric bass guitars were pretty much derived from upright bass, and all of the early electric bass players came from a double bass background. The rubber muting gives more of an upright feel with that heavy attack and sudden decay, so a lot of the playing styles and lines would translate really well. However, it wasn't long before those rubber mutes would be a thing of the past and players were more interested in a brighter tone with longer sustain. But since those days, many players have kept that old muted tone alive using a variety of different methods and techniques. The three most popular methods are right-hand muting, left-hand muting, and foam muting. Right-hand muting is the standard palm muting method you'll see from guitarists. You mute with the palm of your hand and pluck with the thumb. Left-hand muting all comes from the fretting hand. You fret a note, and then you lightly press down the remaining fingers until you get that muted tone. Now, both of these methods are popular and work fine for getting the required sound, but both techniques have limitations in that the muting hand becomes a little restricted. Muting with the fretting hand limits you to fretting with a single finger. And then muting with the picking hand limits you to picking with that single thumb. So the third way is to use some sort of external muting, and the most popular method is by using foam. You can buy some sponge like you might use for washing the dishes and just push it under the strings, and hey presto, you get cheap muting that you can pull in and out as you need. Carol Kay is a huge advocate of this muting method and it works fine. You get the tone and you're free to put both hands to good use without any restrictions. But I've used sponge before and I've always found a few downsides. One is that my intonation always seems to be affected, and this is apparently because of the upward push into the strings. Another downside is that it can be a pain to fit under the strings. It's fine if you've set it all up before a gig and taped it all in place, but switching from non-foam to foam and back mid-set can be a little troublesome. The final downside is that it just doesn't look that nice. I don't really want to buy a cool looking bass only to have badly cut lime green kitchen utensil stuck to the body. Call me vain, but it does look a little cheap. Of course, the other option is to just buy a bridge cover and fit some weather stripping tape to the underside, as you might have seen on my other P-bass on some of my previous videos. Now that obviously works great and gets as close to the original setup as possible, but the only downside is it's fairly permanent. There's no moving between the tones. That bass becomes a muted bass until you decide to unscrew the cover or remove the tape from the underside. Either way, that's not happening on stage mid-set. So this is where the Nordy Mute comes into play. It costs around $40 and I managed to buy it over here in the UK from Bass Direct. You can also buy it directly from Nordstrand. It's a pretty hard piece of rubbery foam with notches cut out for each string. This is attached to a lovely looking piece of wood that allows you to add and remove the mute as and when required. The Nordy Mute logo is also engraved there onto the wood and the whole thing looks pretty classy. So all we have to do is push it down onto the strings. And hey presto, we've got a lovely muted P-bass. The Nordy Mute gives you a pretty heavily muted tone that's nicely consistent across the strings. So on the E and A string, nice muted tone there, and even up on the D and G string, again, gives you a nice tone. It also seems to be better from an intonation standpoint. As I pointed out when using the foam, I always had a problem with the intonation as I moved up the neck, but with the Nordy Mute, it doesn't really change much. You need to adjust the open tuning slightly when it's applied, but the 12th fret is nicely in tune on the D and G strings. And it only starts to falter a little when you get down onto the E and the A strings. But even then, it's not as bad as what I experienced with the sponge. Is it because of the difference in the pressure direction? I'm not sure, but it is noticeable to me. When you buy the Nordy Mute, you have several different options. You can select the type of wood, usually walnut or maple. You can ask for 4 or 5 string versions. You can select the correct string spacing for your bass from 18, 19 or 20 millimeters. And you can also ask for custom builds, if you need, choosing your own spacing and woods. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all product. You can actually tailor the Mute to your own specs. This is a 50s reissue Fender Precision fitted with labella flat wound strings. And I actually love the sound of this bass when it's unmuted, so I didn't want to go down the bridge cover muting route. I wanted to be able to move between muted and unmuted, and the Nordy Mute is perfect for that. So, as I mentioned, these are flat wound strings and I've got the tone rolled back slightly, and it's really good like that for a bunch of different styles. So if you want more of that kind of Motown kind of vibe, okay, you've got that kind of sound. Maybe more of a kind of walking bass vibe. Or maybe even a kind of reggae kind of sound. You can get a lot of different sounds out of it just using that mute. So, how does the Nordy Mute stack up against the muting alternatives? Well, it's obviously more expensive than a kitchen sponge, and muting with your hands is completely free, but I do like being able to free my hands up when playing, and it looks so much better than sponge. It looks more like it belongs on the bass. It's easy to take on and off, and I don't get those intonation issues. So even though it costs $40, for me, the pros are worth it for the price. Okay, so I've put some links for the Nordy Mute in the description below. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know what you think of all this muting talk in the comments. The Talking Bass interviews will be returning in the next few weeks, so get ready for some cool bass player action, and I'll see you next week.